How are you?
Yeah. Good. How have you been? Did you finally find a place to
No, you wouldn't believe it.
call home?
We're now back home, and the internet here is fine. It turns out that there are whole parts of the UK that are just completely impossible. So
Oh God.
we were down in an area called Devon, like southern England, on the sea, on the coast,
Uh-huh.
and it was beautiful. It was like in rolling hills and green countryside, but there was zero phone reception, nothing,
Mhm.
and the internet, they said, was high speed, but it took about 4 hours to load a single photograph. It was crazy.
Uh, that's crazy.
Where are you? Where are you based?
Right now I'm in Nairobi, Kenya.
Okay,
Yeah.
is that where you live?
Yeah, that's where I've been living. I went to school. I've been living here, then I went to school in Canada, and then after like 3 years I came back. So since the last 2 years I've been based in Nairobi.
Okay, cool.
And then I think in September I might be heading out to go and pursue my PhD studies
Oh wow.
in the same school that I was in Canada,
Whereabouts in Canada?
in Winnipeg.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
And what will the PhD be on?
peace building, but I'm focusing mainly on the work everyday people are doing using arts to create kind of structural, to deconstruct structural violence and like kind of create everyday peace
Wow, how amazing.
um, and everyday kind of resistance to oppression. I will be looking at the case study of Kenya, but also Canada actually, because people will
Okay.
imagine, okay, there's no problem in Canada or any other place with structural violence, and everyday oppression. So I will do a comparison, look at some of the things that everyday people are already working on
Hmm.
using the arts,
Wow.
using music, using performing arts, using creative arts, just to see how they are dealing, like working on different issues in Kenya and in Canada.
Do you see there being parallels between the two in terms of some of the challenges that people face, or is it very different?
Yeah, there might be like kind of like similarities, like issues that are global in a sense, but I think also some of the issues will be like kind of like historical and contextual,
Hmm. Of course.
probably,
Yeah.
because uh, a lot of issues that are there emanate from history, from contextualized realities, historical realities of those communities, you know. Of course, Kenya is post-colonial society, but also Canada has its own kind of like dealing with colonialism, especially between different groups.
Hmm.
Yeah. So it will be interesting to see what the arts are doing, like whether they are holding the kind of like hope for the future for these
Yeah.
communities, and not even, if not hope for the future, kind of like if they provide spaces for people to reflect, to imagine how change could happen.
It sort of
That would
unlocks.
be something that is.
It's so beautiful. Yeah.
Go
It's
ahead, please.
no, I was saying it's sort of it unlocks new ways of thinking, doesn't it? In a way that more rigid approaches, I think, don't offer in quite the same way. The arts are just such a creative form of coming at challenges from a totally different perspective, and sort of
Yeah,
seeing new ways of what's possible, and that's what makes them, to me, one of the most powerful tools for addressing these issues. Is that an
exactly.
innate creativity that they provide. That's so exciting.
Yeah.
And is that the work? Are you doing that work? Obviously, you're talking about that coming from a kind of academic perspective from with your PhD, but is that the work that you're doing day to day as well in
Yeah.
Nairobi?
Yeah. So actually, I was an artist before I became like kind of a peace builder and an
Okay.
academic.
Okay.
And my artistic work emanated from the kind of like frequent outbreak of violence in my country, Kenya.
Mm.
But also, I became an artist because of also my lived experience as a young person,
Okay.
because I was street connected in Nairobi, Kenya. I came from rural Kenya to
Okay.
Nairobi. And I came because my parents, I lost them on HIV and AIDS in the
Oh,
rural
wow.
areas, but they had lived
Okay.
in Nairobi and we moved up
Okay.
country. And then life became so complex because one after the other of my parents died. And then now I decided, like at the age of 9, to leave my rural area, which is Western Kenya, or Kakamega, to come to Nairobi because we had lived in Nairobi and I had this feeling that Nairobi was like the place where I was natural
Yeah.
than the rural area. Because in the rural areas, these times, those days, a lot of young people were being taken care of by extended family members after, because during that time we had our own pandemic. The world has its own pandemic right now, but we have had our own pandemic for so many years called HIV and AIDS.
Mm.
And it really wiped out. It was a death sentence for many people, for many communities here. I was like one of the people that was directly impacted by that. So after I lost my parents, I decided to come to Nairobi, landed in Nairobi. I did not know anyone. I was 9 years old, joined the streets of Nairobi, became street connected for a couple of years. I was discovered by a group of street connected performers, like theater performers, uh, that was mainly comprising of street young people, street connected. And the people that actually uh, formed this group was one Kenyan filmmaker and another one was an actress who is very popular in Kenya, but she died. God rest her soul in peace. And the filmmaker is still alive. These two had been tasked by UNICEF to produce a film, a short film, feature film, that highlighted the plight of African children.
Mm-hmm.
And so they decided to go to the streets and work with kids who are living on the streets. And so actually, they produced a film, a short film called Usilie Mtoto Africa. Is a Swahili word meaning do not cry, child of Africa. So we did rehearsals, street connected rehearsals, and went back to the streets until we produced a play with the help of these two amazing Kenyans. And eventually we produced a film that now, instead of saying, so the film was actually made street kids to go around the world. So we went to New York, we went to Berlin for UNICEF celebrations. But when we came back, we went back to the streets. So it became a little bit complex. So eventually the idea was mooted for finding a home for us. And that did not materialize quickly. So eventually what happened was that it took a couple of like 2 years, and then one person, well-wisher, decided to rent us a house with only mattresses. And eventually, so we were told, this is a house, you can stay here, but now I will be able to pay your rent for 1 year. After that, I'm out. So we started to perform in churches, in schools, in everywhere, and ask for food and ask for things to keep us going until eventually a street children's home and theater was founded called Shangilia Mtoto Africa, which means now Rejoice Child of Africa, not Don't Cry Child of Africa. So, so uh, through that program, actually, I got an education. I continued to do my acting. Many other young people did the same. I became a teacher there, social worker later with the kids. And when I went to university, I joined a group of volunteer students, university students that were working. That time there was outbreak of post-election violence in Kenya. And there was a group of students that volunteered to form like a theater, uh, forum theater organization to respond to working communities caught in the conflict between ethnic groups.
Okay.
So we went to ethnic groups in the Rift Valley, mainly to work with fighting communities, to try and do workshops using foreign theater and using other forms of creative arts. That is an organization called the Amani People's Theater, means Peace People's Theater. The word Amani is a Swahili word for peace. So actually, Amani People's Theatre really like invested in us so much. They trained us in different art forms of, for example, theater of the oppressed, playback theater, storytelling for peace, specifically for peace and social justice. And this is a place where we really grew in leaps and bounds, and began to be trainers. I worked with prisons with Amani People's Theatre as a theatre facilitator for prisons on restorative justice. I worked with kids on gender-based violence issues and kind of prevention of rape and violence in the poor communities of Nairobi, in Kibera, in a place called Mukuru, worked with communities. I also worked in other countries. I worked in Somalia on creating awareness around issues of mines, kind of landmines, with young people with UNICEF, using theater, worked in Sierra Leone, worked in Liberia on human rights issues after the war, using theater. I worked in South Sudan also, especially supporting artists in South Sudan. I worked there in 2013, but I also worked there. When I was in Canada, actually, they invited me to come back and do a workshop for artists because there was outbreak of violence between ethnic groups in Juba, and the artists were going to schools and they were going to community centers to use art, facilitate kind of like healing of trauma and dialogue that is kind of like rooted in humanization and breaking cycles of violence. So, well, when I went to Winnipeg to study, I went to Winnipeg in 2015. I stayed there until 2018. And I was mainly teaching school children, doing storytelling in schools. So before I went to Winnipeg, actually, someone might ask, how did you end up in Winnipeg, one of the cold cities in Canada? I had been invited because the University of Manitoba, they have a Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. They had actually scanned the internet and they saw our work online. And they had invited me in 2013 to come and do, they have like an international storytelling festival for peace. And they had looked for people in Africa and they found my work. They invited me and my colleague from the Amani People's Theatre to come to Winnipeg to do our storytelling for peace. We worked with schools, we worked with prisons in Winnipeg. So when I came back to school in 2015 now, it was to do my master's in peace and conflict studies. It was an opportunity also to continue working with communities. So I worked with schools during the festival, but also any other time I was invited by schools. I joined the Manitoba Storytellers Guild, and I was assigned doing storytelling with school children in the libraries, in the schools. And eventually, I did my practicum in a kind of newcomer refugee center for young people in Winnipeg. And I worked with that center to set up like a playback theater troupe to deal with refugee newcomer issues with host communities. And that work was supported by Canadian Museum for Human Rights. They gave me space because they knew my story. My story is featured in the museum because of my work in the continent here in Africa. So that playback theater troupe is still doing its work. It's a young people's theater. So I'm very proud about that. So that's, I mean, I can go on and on and on. I don't want to go on.
I wish you would. Oh my gosh, what an amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Just to live as a child, to have experienced it so profoundly, and then to carry that through your whole life and your whole career and your work and everything. It's just, I doubt there are a few people who can advocate for the power of what the arts can do more effectively than and authentically than yourself. I mean, it's just amazing, and I don't really want to tell you about my my journey because it feels so pathetic compared to what you've been through. But it really is amazing. Do you, throughout all of this, do you have a feeling about what is if you had to kind of identify the main impact of everything? What do you see the changes being with all these different people and all these groups that you've worked with? Are there common impacts or common outcomes that you see for the people that you work with through your engagement with them?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the other thing that I just remembered quickly is that while I was in Winnipeg and in Nairobi, I worked with this group, amazing group that is working with climate change called Theatre Action for Climate Change. That is an amazing group that gave me an opportunity also to do some amazing conversations and dialogue here in Nairobi and in Winnipeg on issues of climate change and the importance of those things. So that's on the side. But now in terms of change, the thing is, like I've just mentioned, I was first an artist before I became a peace builder or kind of like use art for social change work. And the reason is because kind of like art was my natural response to conflict or to trauma or to violence. And maybe because I came into this space from my own lived experience with violence, especially violence at a very young age, and being uprooted from my home and these kind of experiences. So I discovered that a lot of mainstream approaches, for example, even to conflict transformation or peace building, they are really rooted in, like, most of them are academic, and sometimes they don't really resonate with the realities on the ground. Or when you think about international aid industry, or when you think about even international peace building project, much of it is too much of like cookie cutter and kind of ticking boxes rather than humanization and how people every day, how do you build everyday agency, kind of how do you reclaim, how can people themselves reclaim their humanity and their human agency from cycles of violence that are kind of like coming out of historical fragmentation of societies across issues of ethnicity, issues of gender, issues of religious identities. I discovered from doing my work that these complexities are very hard to symbolize or even metaphorize, like, but theater provides the kind of the container and the metaphor, container of metaphors, for example, where you are able now to examine through kind of like, so lived experience combines also with kind of like with new knowledge that comes from others or from other sources to break cycles of violence or to transform cycles of violence. So, and then, so theater or the arts provides the humanizing aspects that any other approaches do not really have. When you think about it, when you think about, because there is also like issues of like context, contextualization, and cultural relevant experiences that people learn from when they are living in this kind of lived experiences, rather than something that someone else is telling you. I just realized that power that is given to you from outside cannot bring the change that you look for. But when agency comes from within, then the change that comes from within is actually the change that will last generations and will break the cycles of violence that we do every. And the arts provide that beyond language, because I have worked across different languages, but that has never been a problem for me when I'm working in Juba or when I'm working with young people in Winnipeg who have been refugees in Nairobi and then they found themselves in a Canadian city like that one. So the arts becomes the symbolism and the metaphor to explore complexities of even migration or even issues of identity, who am I in the world, and knowledge as well.
That's so interesting. Do you think it's something to do with sort of, I don't want to say suspending reality because that's not the right thing, but in some ways separating out the theatre and the stage is an inherently creative and safe space where you're not having to kind of confront this reality, this very challenging reality in a kind of formal and academic way, with being told how to do something. it's something about liberating yourself from the kind of the day-to-day and removing yourself. Do you think, is that what makes it so different and more effective? What do you think it is about the theatre and the space, the art form?
Yeah, art forms, for instance, like one of the things I've always told people in Africa, in the African kind of like worldview, theater, there is no separation between stage and actors. For example, theater is a repertoire of different dramatic things. So you have like song, dance, performing, and use of words and orality. So sometimes the theater gives you, it's very contextual, and it's part of like people's lived experience, part of people's humanization. And especially it becomes an ally of oppressed people because it provides the space, not just the safe space, but the imaginary space, the imaginary. Because a lot of communities that I work with or that we have worked with, most of them are in what you'll easily call the liminal space. And that liminality becomes a very difficult place, kind of like to capture all the processes, the complex processes that are happening all at the same time. Theater gives the symbolism and the metaphor, like I said, to be able to put meaning, to make meaning of these experiences. Because one of the biggest challenges for communities or lived experiences that find themselves in these kind of spaces is putting meaning to these experiences. And words sometimes might not be enough to talk about everything. When you come from societies where people many times put a lot of emphasis on use of words, in places where there's chronic violence and broken down systems, sometimes it's very hard to have words that explain everything.
Yeah.
The use of song, use of dramatic arts,
yeah,
use of kind of like theater provides the connectivity that people are looking for and the humanization that communities are yearning to kind of realize.
Yeah. I can see that. Words. I'm a musician, so I live in the world of music, and I think words are one of the least effective ways of communicating something. Often, if I think about conducting an orchestra, for example, the most effective conductors can communicate everything they need to say through their eyes, through a gesture of their hand, through a slight change of their body. And if I sit and observe amazing rehearsals with incredible conductors, there's very little speak. There's very little chat. And the most effective and productive rehearsals are when the conductor really has to communicate what he or she is looking for, really, from how she or he is moving or demonstrating something with their hands or their baton. Or so I completely agree, and I think I have a danger sometimes of using too many words and chatting too much. I think I sometimes need to stop myself. And it was the same when I was trained to be a teacher. The most effective teachers often sit back and actually speak very little. And the most brilliant learning in the class happens when the children or the young people take the learning on for themselves and work on that together. And I think I was brought up in the education. We've been told to think about arts for education. And I think my education was amazing. It was an amazing education, but it was quite old-fashioned. And I was taught by people who would stand at the front of the classroom and talk to us. And from quite a young age, I mean, definitely at secondary school, it was quite a kind of lecture to a university environment. And I think our teachers got away with it because we were all quite sort of well behaved and happy to just sit there and be taught like that. But when I was a teacher, I started out my career as a teacher, and I quickly realized that was going to get me absolutely nowhere, because the young people I was working with were not prepared to sit, quite rightly, and just listen to me yak on about something. So I quickly had to find creative ways to explain a concept and then get them to live and experience that concept, whatever it might be, from themselves, through their bodies, through creating something new, through clapping, through movement, through playing with a percussion instrument, whatever it might be. You know, an example of like, well, how do you explain what rhythm is?
Yeah.
You can't sit at the front of the classroom and say, right on the blackboard, rhythm is combination of different lengths of notes and how they all fit together. Like that's so abstract, it doesn't mean anything. But to understand what rhythm is, you need to do something that is rhythmical and get up and clap and move. And I so I understand what you're saying, is that this some things are too complicated to talk about in a way, and they have to be experienced through different forms and different ways of articulating or expressing something, and words are only a very small part of that. And I wonder, they asked us to think about what the flaws are in the education system. I don't know about the Kenyan education system, but I wonder whether we put too great an emphasis on the spoken word or the written word, particularly here in the UK. I mean, I totally believe that literacy and being able to read and write is fundamentally important to all children, but I think it can do down the children for whom that's not their natural mode of communication. And I think that's quite unfair. And I wonder whether an arts for education movement could think much more creatively about how young people can express themselves and communicate that they have learned something and they understand. It doesn't have to be through they have to write that down in an exam paper. I mean, it'd be much more amazing if they could put on a play or write a song or something that showed they understood a concept without having to write it all down in a kind of timed, very forced, sort of inauthentic environment that is an exam. I just don't feel that's a very useful way to assess intelligence or competence somehow. I just think it's fundamentally flawed.
Totally. And yeah, so the other thing that arts also provides is the paradox, kind of like between like even issues of emotion and reality comes into question for people who are especially going through the liminal spaces that I've just talked about. And actually, as you spoke about school and education and art, I was just thinking about, for example, the role of emotions also like have been downplayed in the kind of the inauthentic, like you're saying, the inauthentic education system. And my work, part of my work, the reason why I learned so many things also is like our theater we used a lot of like participatory theater, which is forum theater, and all these other aspects of theater that was founded by Augusto Boal, who's Brazilian. But Augusto Boal learned a lot of he developed his theater from the works of Paulo Freire. And many people know Paulo Freire as a popular educationist and kind of like building democratic education, where the banking, like the banking method, he critiques the banking methods where the teacher knows everything, he's the one telling the students everything, like he's the source of all information. And he advocates for kind of like conscientization of social issues, but also mainly democratic education, where like there's co-creation of knowledge. And when you think about it, there's big debates right now in the field of social change on issues of knowledge and power, because the one who like in this rote learning kind of context, the didactic ways of learning, memorize everything that you've learned. The teacher is the one giving you knowledge. It creates power imbalance, especially for groups that have experienced oppression and violence, where, for example, the knower and the one subject object, knower and knowee dichotomy, those kind of disparities in the field of knowledge is one of those things that people are looking at now to think about, like, what is the difference between technical knowledge, lived experience knowledge, expert knowledge, and everyday life knowledge? Where do this, does everyday life knowledge has legitimacy as a form of knowledge, as a form of knowing, especially when we think about, like, now in the world there is a lot of issues around, for example, indigenous way of being in the world, indigenous ways of knowing, even on issues of climate change, even like as forms of education. Who decides what becomes the legitimate way of knowing and the legitimate form of education, when the legitimate way of learning? You know, these are some of the questions that are really coming out in the fields of climate change, in the fields of social justice, in the fields of kind of like anti-colonization, fields of like working on issues of gender, you know. So, and the education system is like the socializing institution in many places, just like the political party or the family. The school is where norms and social norms are created or deconstructed. So school becomes like space for kind of like learning and unlearning for young people.
And have you seen examples of schools where they are living living in some of this? Because I think sometimes the problem is that these conversations happen that are so interesting and so important and potentially could change the entire way in which we think about how we educate our children. That's happening in one space, and then the schools are just continuing because they have to, because they have pressures and they have targets and they have things that they have to meet and demonstrate, and they have funding issues, and they just don't have that space or that headspace to really engage with the bigger conversations and the kind of more creative ways of thinking about this. I say that just because I've been on both sides of the coin. I'm now living in the world of social change, community arts, and have that freedom and that liberation to think a bit more creatively about how we deliver work and co-create work with young people in my field particularly, but with others too. But I also spent time as a teacher in a school, uh, and I know how pressured and time poor you are every day, and you just need to kind of get through this curriculum, and you need to teach what they need to know for the exam, because you as a teacher have to be held accountable for them getting the grades they need to be successful in the world. And there's just very little freedom to kind of innovate, I think,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
education. And I think there are some schools for sure in the UK, and I'm sure in Kenya too, and all around the world, who are incredibly innovative and doing great things. But I'd say the mainstream is not there yet. And
yeah,
I wonder how you bring the two together so that the two connect.
yeah.
I'm not sure what the not sure what the
Yeah,
answer is, but
that,
it needs to
that,
happen.
that's a very good question, you know. You just reminded me, like, I went back to teach in the center where I was a young, when we left streets, we went there to live there, and we went through, the system becomes kind of like learn and become who we are today. So I was a teacher with, like, imagine you're teaching in a school that is getting children from the streets. They come to this center, they have to attend a class. Kind of, some of them drop school from a very lower grade, the others drop from school from a very higher grade, which means they have to come, like, maybe you have to sit together if you follow the curriculum. So, like you're saying, the pressures of the curriculum, the government curriculum, is one of those kind of structural violent things that affect education systems in the whole world, especially for government-run schools or even regulated schools. Even private schools are regulated by government, for example, in Kenya. So when I taught in a street children's school, it became very, very critical. Like, how are we going to teach this kind of students? Because they are not normal, like, kind of your normal kind of kids in a school who are coming from families or coming from home. And it might even affect not just street kids, but even like kids who are in, like, in Nairobi, for example, we have like slums or informal settlements. The kids who come from these families face myriad challenges. Like, they are, I mean, the levels of trauma is very, very high. Structural violence, gang violence, and all these kind of things. how do you teach these kids in a classroom, just like kids who come from any other normal kind of situation? So those are critical questions that are emanating. And it became very hard even to have a curriculum to teach former street kids. So what we spent a lot of time, we created an informal curriculum with many other, so there's a whole movement of people who are trying to create something different and innovative. There's one school in Nairobi called the Kenya Creative School that actually doesn't grade kids. Most of the kids who come here, they don't get like a grade. It's not formal, but they find a lot of challenges. Like when kids come of a certain age, they have either to join a government school or they have to come to a normal formal school. So those are some of the challenges. And I remember we taught kids, for example, we taught mathematics using dance, and it resonated better and well for kids who are struggling to stop sniffing glue while they are in an institution. So these are, but I know this is an area that needs a lot of creativity and innovation at the moment, so that the arts become part of the learning system in the whole world. Especially countries like ours, we really need that. When I was young, in the schools where we went, there was art and craft, but it was really curriculum based. But whenever we went and sat under a tree, and some of my friends in the class were telling stories, folk tales, that made school more fun than a teacher who was teaching me how to memorize math and numbers by writing on a blackboard when I was only like 9 years old.
Yeah. I think that's the problem, isn't it? That the arts and the creativity just gets shoved into a corner.
Yeah.
And in the UK, that corner is getting smaller and smaller, and the space for it is getting smaller. So instead of going the right way, I think it's going the wrong way. And like you say, there's room for creativity in every single subject that we learn. And I think the problem is it just gets kind of demarcated to a very particular subject or particular subject area, and doesn't get brought into the maths classroom or the science classroom. Or but why shouldn't it? I mean, I struggled with maths at school, and I think it was partly because it was such an uncreative environment. I just couldn't understand why we were doing it. It had no relevance to me whatsoever. And I think if we'd had a more creative way in, I would have actually quite enjoyed it, because I like sort of solving puzzles and that kind of thing. But I just I couldn't relate what I was being taught with anything that impacted my life at all. And I the space for creativity, I mean, even like you say, the arts and crafts, the music, when it was quite curriculum based, it didn't feel that exciting. The most exciting musical moments I have were outside of school completely.
Yeah, exactly.
But it sounds like there are so many interesting models that we could turn to and look at that are kind of in non-formal education environments, or education environments that are for non-traditional young people who have come through a very challenging experience, or like you were saying with the street children. There's so much we can learn, I think, from those kinds of organizations and initiatives. And I think part of the problem is there's not enough, like I was saying before, there's not enough space in the leaders of these schools that don't have the time to really engage innovatively. I mean, wouldn't it be amazing if in every school we had a leader of innovation whose job it was to look out from beyond the school gates and to go out into the community and to see what amazing work was being done in the community, and to bring that into the school, and to channel it out into the school environment, into all the different subject areas. I think that would be an amazing role. And we just but it just needs resourcing, and it needs time, and it needs attention. And I think one can't expect the current leaders of these schools to do that for themselves, because I just don't think they have that capacity. And maybe in some cases they don't have the inclination, but I think the majority of head teachers and school leaders genuinely want their school and their learning experience for their young people to be extraordinary. And I think they all come at this from a great intention. It's just that you quickly, particularly in the UK anyway, they quickly get sort of drained by the amount of reporting and inspections and targets that they have to meet. It ceases to be a creative role.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember thinking when I was a teacher, I left teaching because I found it too restrictive and I found it too limiting. And I thought I could have more impact outside of the classroom than in it.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah. Really. Yeah. It's not. They're not creative environments in the way that they could be. I don't think. And yeah. But I often thought if I was going to stay in teaching, I wouldn't want to move up sort of the career progression, the traditional. I wouldn't want to kind of go and be a head of year and then a deputy head teacher and then become a head teacher, because I think the role got less and less and less creative and less innovative as you go up the pole. And so there's another interesting route for people, which is to not have to kind of feel they have to, in order to progress, they don't have to kind of go up through that very traditional trajectory of classroom teacher ultimately to become a head teacher. It'd be great if you could stay and be in the classroom and progress your career, but stay as a classroom teacher and be allowed to grow in that role, as opposed to kind of having to go into leadership positions. And I think there's some initiatives in the UK that are looking at that as to how do you become a master teacher and dedicate your time to the classroom as opposed to dedicating your time to school leadership, which I think is quite an exciting initiative, because I think if we can create the space for outstanding teachers to develop their creativity, develop their innovation, develop ways of doing things, then that will also create change, as well as by changing the way in which leaders think about how they bring this in. So, but yeah, it was not happening when I was teaching, and I didn't feel that I could.
You just reminded me. I was invited by one prof in the university where I was, in University of Manitoba, in 2018. He's in the education department, and he's a very innovative kind of he comes from he loves theater, use of theater and arts in education. So he invited me to create with him a class, kind of forum theater that kind of investigates teaching experiences of teachers, trainee teachers. And so what happened is that we created this kind of so first of all, we had a workshop sharing with trainee teachers about forum theater, what it all means, what it entails, what is forum theater, and everything. And then we developed a short plays, actually one short play that now was showcased before trainee teachers and university administrators and education officials from the district, from outside the university. I mean, it was very amazing to see how play brought out some of these issues in the story. And with forum theater, there is room for audience members also to become part of the act. So they can stop the play at any moment and say, okay, I would like to suggest this kind of alternative to the story.
Oh, wow.
I was very amazed to see education officials and even university kind of administrators coming into play and kind of suggesting or providing alternatives for what a trainee teacher will do in that kind of situation, and vice versa. It was quite fascinating and enriching experience.
Totally, and it's amazing to unlock that new way of looking at it, which is just involved taking them into a new sort of space in terms of headspace, and giving them permission to come up with what they might see as sort of outlandish or ridiculous ideas that actually would be really great if they were allowed to happen.
And ridiculous ideas really came, and some people laughed at them and they say, this can't work, or this can work, or why do people say that, so the dialogue, I mean, the shift that will usually not happen maybe in ideal situations, where there is power imbalances.
Yeah, exactly, because everyone was sort of allowed to be equal in that space, and no one was afraid of saying something wrong or or offending or upsetting through an idea, because it was all essentially make believe because it was through story.
Yeah,
But
the safety of, and that is something else that the arts provide, like theater provides the kind of make-believe kind of safe space where people feel like, after all, we are just playing, you know?
Yeah.
It's really serious, you know?
Yeah.
But the shift is happening.
Do you think it's something about this, the stakes feel lower in that space? So if you're sitting, if you're sitting around a conference table in a meeting room and you're trying to come up with innovation and strategies for creativity in your curriculum, that's just the least, it feels like it's a high stakes environment because you're all sitting there and you've all been brought here to do that thing.
Yeah.
Even if you're in your mind, you're not really there that day, or you've had a bad night's sleep or whatever, you have to get to the solution within the next 2 hours because you've been brought to this meeting to think about creative ideas.
Yes.
It's just inherently the least creative way of being creative, and the stakes are too high. There's too much pressure. There's too much pressure on people.
It's very much pressure. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And you see, creativity gives you the room, I mean, to take off pressure from yourself, you know, and kind of like you feel safe, you feel like it's authentic. So the authenticity also comes in.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of paradox, like I said, you know, and especially you had mentioned something also, if aesthetics are involved, like you can also symbolize things, you know, with acting. You can be able, and you can also like act a role that probably naturally you might not be able to act that kind of a role. If you're a trainee teacher, you can act the role of an administrator, an education administrator, without necessarily being one, you know. So that gives possibilities that are not possible, like kind of in the real world. Yeah.
Maybe it just needs to become the real world. The real world needs to be more playful, less serious.
The playful world should be the real world.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. I mean, I inhabit these spaces because I have a 2.5-year-old downstairs whose whole world is playful, and that is her reality. She lives. I think I read something that play is the work of a child. Yeah. And I love that idea that play is what her job. She's just, her main role in life is to play right now. But like, when do I love that.
So go ahead.
I also wonder when we lose that, and I think we lose that. I think we lose that too soon. Even from in the UK anyway, from quite a young age, I think children lose that play is their work. And I think there's something around trying to retain that as we grow up feels quite important.
It's good. And I also have, like, I think I have almost your age. I have 2 of them, and when you listen to them, they tell you stuff that is really interesting. Like, they're so innovative, they're so creative. But then I think with time, the structures and the systems of kind of like control kick in. And they start to tell them, like, you shouldn't be doing that, you shouldn't be doing the other one, you know?
Yeah.
And then actually, it's a form of dehumanization. The schools, I read this one thing that was saying that schools can become a place where, like, people are conditioned to lose creativity rather than have creativity. So the schooling system becomes like the process for removing creativity from our human experience.
It's terrible. It's completely tragic. I hate it. I don't want them to ever go to school now. Just keep them at home forever and just keep playing. No, but it's very sad that things have got to that point, isn't it? That's where creativity goes to be ended, is through school. And I just think there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way of retaining that through everything that they do as they grow up, and not making it something to be. I think, particularly here, we have our teenagers are quite embarrassed to be creative. They're embarrassed to kind of use their physicality, to use their voice, to sing, to kind of communicate through anything other than pretty much text messages or WhatsApp on a phone. and it's just kind of got so small and awkward, and kind of you can just hide behind these screens now. I do worry about it for my own too, selfishly, but also for the wider group of children here. I think you know, at a kind of micro level, there are really wonderful things happening in schools, and you know, absolutely do not want to undermine the incredible work of amazing teachers and educators, but I think there's just structural problems around it that need to be addressed in terms of where the arts are, how they're valued in an educational context, and how they're prioritized. And I just feel they're just being deprioritized and shoved into the corner all the time, and it's just making the educational experience of young people very narrow, and like you say, inherently uncreative, which is really, really sad. And there's so much more we can do. But I also think it's on us as artists and educators and community artists to be able to articulate and share as effectively and as convincingly as possible why the arts matter. Because I think we all believe it and we all see it and we all know it. But I think we have to find ways of bringing others on side who may be more cynical or less likely to be on board. Because I think we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, aren't we? We all believe this and we all see it and we all know this is important, but we have to, in order to really create change, we have to bring in people who are not convinced. We have to turn them around, and that's kind of on us.
We have to do that, and we have to create like kind of like movement. We have to amplify voices that we know that are happening in different corners of the world. We have to amplify those voices. We have to create synergies. We have to develop alliances and kind of like put together people with the same kind of beliefs like as we are, so that it becomes like a movement of everyday people that is believing in this kind of inherently in this, the power of the arts, especially in education. And different forms of education. And we can find these across ethnicities, across cultures, across countries, across regions. And that is why we have to be on the lookout for what is happening in different places, however, how small, because the small initiatives, the small processes can actually be leveraged by hooking into other processes across the continents, you know? And like you said, I think there's a lot of amazing things that are happening in many places, albeit in smaller ways. But we need to reach deep into these kind of places and be able to encourage this kind of social kind of like change work to continue that is art-based. The arts are not additionals, they are not anecdotal, they are the mainstream, you know. They are the language of the art. It's a whole language movement. It's a universal language. The arts are a universal language, actually. So that is why, as a musician, as a former musician, and as a practicing musician, as a former teacher, you know, and I'm very sure even music helped you to do your teaching work. So these kind of things are very, very, they are very, very interconnected, and we need just to find ways of interconnecting and creating social movements across contexts to be able to showcase the power of the arts, the humanizing power of the arts, because they're humanizing.
Yeah, the humanizing power of the arts. That's what we need to do. I mean, I think that's where Community Arts Network can be so powerful, is bringing these people together and creating these synergies and connections. And I really like their idea of having the arts as the focus, but looking at that from multiple perspectives. So arts for business, arts for climate, arts for democracy, arts for well-being, arts for education. And I think coming from all those different perspectives and bringing people in who might not previously have considered themselves to be artists or creatives, I think that's where the power of community arts network can lie. Is I think they talk about unlikely allies, and I like that phrase. I think we need to build this network of unlikely allies and show and share what can be achieved when you place creativity and the arts at the center of how you think about the world. So hopefully we can support Can in their mission to do that through our respective.
Yeah, actually, I really love that space and that platform and that experience that Can is creating. Like you're saying, I like the multi-perspectivity. I like the multidisciplinarity of the kind of work we are doing. I like the inclusivity and the collectivity of this kind of work, linking individual to collective work, linking individual liberation to structural liberation, you know? It's very like, I mean, so Can is providing this kind of like space to imagine and to kind of put meaning to these experiences as we go through the liminal spaces today of global pandemics, you know, this connection that is coming because of that. The arts will be the thing that will be able to help us to kind of humanize each other. And also like, you know, at the end of the day, I believe one of the most important things is the emancipation of people, so that the arts become emancipatory approaches to structural issues that oppress people across the globe, you know. Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
Should we leave it there?
We should leave it here.
On that note. That's a good place to end, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's so nice to talk to you.
Me too. I've learned a whole deal of things, you know.
Gosh, me too. Me too. Yeah. And it'd be great to keep in touch. And obviously there'll be stuff going on with the launch of Can next week, and hopefully we'll connect again.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yay!
Thank you.
So nice to chat, and have a lovely rest of Sunday.
You too. Have a good one, and have a good time. Take care of yourself and your family.
You too. Take care. Stay safe. Thanks so much. Bye.